And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis here showing, again, a little bit, this area of ice along the eastern Arctic coast are continuing to thin out, and maybe by early next week it'll be completely gone there, if not sooner. And then the entire Arctic coastal areas and the fairways offshore will be sea ice free. And for tonight's forecast, this strong low pulls into the southern Bering Sea, north of the eastern Aleutians there. So gale and storm force winds around that center and good gales in advance of this front as it rolls across Bristol Bay up into the Kuskokwim Delta and into Kodiak Island with pretty good winds and rain. Otherwise, showers will be on the decrease over southern Alaska later this evening. Dry in the central interior, showers up here to the north and northeast, and diminishing showers for the southeast coast. And for tomorrow, central southern panhandle pretty dry. That low center now right up into the southwest interior, slowly weakening, but good winds coming around that. Still some gale force winds going and even storm force gusts there for the Alaska Peninsula. Pretty windy and occasionally wet here, wettest in the upslope areas, eastern and southeast mountain faces there, and into the North Gulf Coast, with gusty winds, but dry up here over the northern interior, especially north of the Alaska Range there, with those high wind watches out and wind advisories for possible 50 to 70 mile an hour wind gusts. And for Friday, westerly flow now takes over, kind of breezy, showery, cool, and unsettled over much of interior Alaska, but maybe some sun breaks from Cook Inlet on down into the Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, even the Alaska Peninsula, the Fox Islands could see some sun on Friday. Showers for the Panhandle and North Gulf Coast. And light rain, fog, and drizzle here along the southwest coast. Next system bringing gale force winds into the western and then the central Aleutians. Coastal water forecast for the southeast coast on the south coast, west to northwest winds 15 knots with 5-foot seas. And the central coast here, westerlies at 15 knots, and then southeast 15 to 25 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots. Southeast at 15 for Stevens Passage. And Clarence Strait, winds will be northwest at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. Northwest 20 knots for Clarence Strait on Friday. Southeast 20 knots, gust 35 for Stevens Passage. And small craft advisories for Lynn Canal. South winds at 30 knots with 5-foot seas. Northwest 20 knots on the south coast and 9-foot seas. Otherwise, westerlies 15 to 20 knots on the central coast. And south to west winds 15 to 20 knots for the north coast. Prince William Sound tomorrow, small craft advisories, east winds 25 knots. And east-southeast 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. East at 20 for the western North Gulf Coast and Kodiak Island. The Barren Islands. Gale warnings, same thing for Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings in both those locations. East winds 35 knots, 10-foot seas. East to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots for Cook Inlet. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, small craft advisories. Southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. West 30 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, the western North Gulf Coast. Over toward Middleton Island, southwest at 25 knots with 12-foot seas here. Prince William Sound, southwest 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Kodiak Island, gale warning, Shelikof Strait, southeast 35 there. Otherwise, south winds at about 30 knots with 12-foot seas. But for the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings. South winds 40 to 45 knots. Possible gusts to 50 or 55 knots here for the western peninsula. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay. Southeast winds 35 knots, seas 8 feet. Small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula on Friday. Southwest winds 25 knots, southwest 30 knots for Bristol Bay, and west-southwest here, Kodiak Island at 30 knots with seas 11 to 13 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians for Thursday, on Alaska Island, southwest 45 knots, Unimak Island, west at 35 knots, Adak and Atka, west-northwest 30 knots there with seas 11 to 14 feet. And Amchitka Island, west 25, Kiskadishimia, southwest at 20, or west at 20. And then with that next front approaching out west there, southwest winds back up to gale force here, 40 knots from Kiskadishimia, 35 knots southwesterlies from Amchitka Island, all the way to Atka. And for the eastern Aleutians, small craft advisories, winds southwest, mostly at 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, southern Nunivak Island, east winds 30 knots, northeast 20 knot winds for the Yukon Delta coast. St. Lawrence Island becoming east at 20 for Norton Sound. Small craft advisories here. St. Matthew Island down across the Pribilofs, north winds 25 to 30 knots. For Friday, St. Paul and St. George Island looking at a southwest wind of 30 knots, seas at about 11 feet. West 25 for St. Matthew Island, same thing for the Yukon Delta coast and Norton Sound, and west at 30 for St. Lawrence Island, otherwise the Kuskokwim Delta coast southwest at 25. Eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow, variable winds at 10 knots, becoming east at 15 for the central coast, southeast 10 on the west side, Chukchi Sea, east winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Friday, winds swing around to the west here for the Chukchi Sea at 20 to 25 knots. Otherwise, the western Arctic coast east at 15, northeast at 10 for the central coast, and a light northwest breeze at 5 to 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.